Last time we spoke about the emerging war between Big Brother China and Little Brother Japan. Li Hongzhang struggled to do everything he possibly could to thwart the outbreak of war with Japan, but he could not stop the inevitable. The Japanese began landing troops, and soon they seized Qing-Japanese, trying to force Korea to take up the reforms that they wanted them to. Li Hongzhang tried to keep the Qing forces at a distance, but the Japanese would not stop reinforcing their position in Korea. Eventually, Li Hongzhang decided to play with what he thought was a Japanese bluff, sending further reinforcements to Asan. But the IJN intercepted the transports and disaster struck. The IJN sank the Kaohsiung and other Qing vessels, ushering in the first shots of the First Sino-Japanese War. The genie was out of the bottle and could not be put back in. This episode is the First Sino-Japanese War Part 2, the Battles of Sangwon and Pyongyang. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and much, much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've just now released an episode on Zhang Zongchang, the dog meat general, the monster behind the meme. Also, just a friendly reminder, I myself now have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And this month's exclusive podcast over there is part 3 of my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author of the Final War Theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The Battle of Pyeongdu and the sinking of the Kaohsiung robbed the Qing of 1,100 men and 12 pieces of artillery, along with other war materials that were gravely needed at Asan. It's important also to remember the major differences between the Japanese and Chinese when it came to their military forces. The Qing were composed of multiple different forces. As a journalist at Le Journal des Débats, Politiques et Lettres said, "There are Chinese troops. There is no Chinese army. Or rather, there are as many armies as there are regions." I know for some of you who've been listening to this series for quite a long time, you will be hearing me repeat the structure of the Qing military all too often. But, you need to imagine some people listening right now probably only joined us for the First Sino-Japanese War. So welcome. And here is how the Qing military works in a nutshell. You have first the 8 banners army, made up of Manchu, Mongols, Muslim, and Han banners. Number 2 is the Green Standard Army, which can be honestly seen more as a armed police force, and it was created mostly because the 8 banners were very outdated. Number 3, we have the Yongying militias, and hired mercenaries alongside them. These are basically regional, mostly privatized armies. And number 4, those very same regional type militia armies, well, when they are foreign trained and given some of the best equipment, and led by people like Li Hongzhang, well, that is a different breed to its own. They can be seen as the very elite troops of the Qing dynasty at this time. Now, the Yongyings were pretty much the bread and butter, serving as kind of a national guard, if you were, and they were sent to all the hot spots within the empire where rebellions would break out. Many of these Yongying types received foreign training, thus they fall into what I just said, the 4th category, making them, like I said, the cream of the crop. Overall, Yongyings and the well-trained troops make up about 10% of the total Qing forces. The Green Standards make up for the vast majority. Li Hongzhang had a personal army, the Hui Army, created to fight the Taiping back in the 1860s. They were the elites, but as Li Hongzhang aged, he lessened his oversight over them. Adding to Li Hongzhang's age, the Qing court was quite reluctant to fund such an army, led by a Han Chinese no less, who might become too powerful and unseat their Manchu rule dynasty. And I mean, they had good reason to worry. Li Hongzhang's teacher was Zhang Guofan, who became so powerful with his private army, he could have done just that. But instead, he chose to retire. I always find it similar to the story of Sulla and the Roman Republic. Now, as you can see, the Qing military is quite regional in nature, with many warlord-like figures controlling private armies and the Qing state controlling the far less effective forces. It severely lacked unity. So too was the situation of the Qing Navy. There were 4 autonomous squadrons: the Pyongyang, Northern, Nanyang, Southern, Fujian, and Guangdong fleets. You will notice I'm going to intertwine the word fleet with squadron a lot, and that actually happens in a lot of sources, so forgive me if I keep flip-flopping on it. Now, only the Pyongyang fleet possessed a modern fleet, based out of Weihaiwei, and it was under the control of Li Hongzhang. Yes, old Li Hongzhang had a lot of firepower under his control. China's arsenals and naval academies were the property of their province of origin, and could not be counted on to supply other provinces in the event of, a war. We saw during the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885 how this could lead to disaster. For example, when Li Hongzhang's Pyongyang fleet declined to help the Nanyang fleet. Well, that very decision would come to bite him right in the ass, as now it would be the Nanyang fleet who would ignore his calls for help. Even within the Pyongyang fleet, the guns and ammunition were not standardized. Gunpowder was local and not appropriate for imported guns, resulting in logistical mayhem. The supply system was likewise very ad hoc and prone to flaws, leading to the Pyongyang squadron, or fleet, see, I just did it there, grossly undersupplied. Again, another reason for all of this ridiculousness was the Manchu not wanting the Han military to be strong enough to overthrow them. The Manchu deliberately prevented the creation of a unified national army, because it was the basis of their strategy since they had defeated the Ming dynasty. The German press would focus on the fundamental weaknesses of the Qing land forces, and on the eve of the war, there was an article that stated this: "The lack of a unified command. Each of the provincial armies was the personal creation of that province's governor. It is naturally in the interest of each provincial viceroy to retain the fruit of his exertions for himself. In no case is he inclined to come to the assistance of a neighbor, who is worse provided, and incur the danger of denuding his own province, for whose safety he is responsible with his head." The same system of individual responsibility applied down through the military ranks. It squelched initiative and promoted defensive rather than preemptive action. By this system, common action is virtually excluded. It really was a terrible system, backed by horrific punishment for failure. Punishments ranged from exile to cudgel blows to outright execution. If you failed to hold your position against an enemy attack, you were decapitated. If you destroyed the arms the Qing government gave you, you would receive a lethal number of cudgel blows. In an era of slow communications, this made things a tremendous nightmare for commanders out in the field. You could not retreat because of the decapitation, and could not destroy your weapons to prevent them from falling into the hands of the enemy. Basically, Qing officers would be forced to go into battle as scheduled and stay there until victory or death. In contrast, the Japanese, as described by the very same German newspaper, had this to say in an article: "When 3 decades ago, Japan awoke out of the sleep of her isolation and attached herself to the civilization of the West, her first care was to reorganize her very army. The result may truly be called astonishing. The Japanese army is in reality a European force, and any one of their army divisions, with the exception of the cavalry, which is small and would look badly mounted, might march through the streets of any town on the continent without, at first sight, being recognized as Oriental troops. Although obviously sprinkled with a bit of 19th century racism, it indeed shows us how Japan had what we would consider a modern army. The Times of London also had this to say about them. They are brave, temperament, patient, and energetic, and though the Chinese might be made, under European officers, as fine soldiers as they are, at this moment they are about 200 years behind them. And although the victory is not always to the strong, as found out in the Boer campaign, from every data that a soldier can judge by the Japanese, they should beat the Chinese in Korea with the greatest of ease. And as for that army, the Japanese army was based on the Prussian model, with universal conscription and a standard term for service. They had the Murata Type 18 breech-loading rifles with the same type of ammunition, 75mm field guns, and mountain pieces based on the Krupp design. While the Qing scrambled for the right ammunition, when it could be found at all because of the rampant corruption involving some embezzlement of military funds, the Japanese had excellent materials and logistical capabilities. The Japanese Navy was based on the British and French, adopting the Jeune d'école doctrine. While the Qing had some very large foreign purchased battleships, the Japanese focused on arming faster cruisers to combat them. Now, the Japanese military strategy for this war was to first seize control of the sea, so they could transport soldiers to the mainland at will. From there, the IJA would invade Korea to expel the Chinese. Once Korea was occupied, Japan would strike at Weihaiwei, which would provide naval access to Beijing. And again, I'll put in a little side note here. While I'll probably flip and flop with saying the word squadron or fleet when it comes to the Pyongyang fleet, you might hear me say Beijing or Peking a lot. It should be called Peking at this time, but I just have this bad habit of saying Beijing. My bad. This could be followed up with an invasion of Jili province, though that notably would be an enormous task. The IJA invading forces would be in two groups. The first IJA army, under Yamagata Aritomo, who would be invading Korea, and then he would enter Manchuria from the north. And the second IJA army, under Marshal Oyama Iwa, who would invade Manchuria from the south and attack the Liaodong Peninsula, hoping to meet with the first IJA at Weihaiwei afterwards. For both nations, the only efficient way to deploy troops to Korea was via the sea. There could be no war if Japan could not ferry her troops. And for China, despite sharing landmass, the situation was arguably the same. China had the railway line between Tianjin to the coast, and north to Shanhaiguan, but that was as good as it got. It did not reach the Korean border by any measure. The road system in Manchuria was terrible, adding to the logistical issue. On the other side, Japan's military got the Japanese mail service, who had a fleet of 90 steamships, to help transport the troops to alleviate other warships for military tasks. Yes, you heard that right. The Japanese post is going to help the war effort. As for the Chinese merchant fleet, which was about 1/3 the size of the Japanese, well, they would barely help out at all. An article from Berlin's Neue Preußische Zeitung stated this: China has 40 troop transports versus Japan's 450. The Germans, blunt as always, and it was obvious to all, controlling the sea would win the war. The Pall Mall Gazette interviewed a longtime resident of Japan, who predicted the war would be won at sea. This is some of what he had to say. Whichever side holds the chief commercial ports of Korea, with the capital, completely controls the country. If Japan succeeds at the outset in sweeping the Chinese from those waters, she wins the key to the whole situation. It would be impossible for China to send up troops since the land route entailed an enormous distance where provisioning and feeding a large army would be unmanageable even for the well-organized European nations. Despite all of these flaws, the Chinese leadership believed that they held time on their side, and that a war of attrition would see them victorious. They also held considerable assets in the Pyongyang fleet, such as their two great ironclad battleships that they had purchased from Germany, the Jingyuan and Qinyuan. However, the Qing warships were overaged and basically obsolete by this time. The real problem was that these ships were ill-maintained. Their crews lacked discipline. The Qing ships were much slower than the Japanese. The two Qing battleships' main armaments were short-barreled guns in twin barbettes mounted in echelon, which could only fire in restricted arcs. Their short barrels meant that their shells had a low muzzle velocity, thus poor penetration and terrible accuracy at a longer range. In the world of warships, we would say these were the type of brawlers you want to bring in close to pound with the broadsides and the secondary guns. Now, the Japanese emphasized quick-firing guns, quicker ships that would outfire the Qing dramatically. There is honestly a litany of issues with the Pyongyang fleet. Take, for example, all of their signal books that were issued to them were written in English, a language very few Pyongyang officers understood, or could read for that matter. But I don't want to delve too much into all of the issues involving the Pyongyang fleet, because that is almost 50% of the entire story about this war, and I just wanted to tease you here. A lot of it's going to come later. Now, when the Japanese began landing forces at Chimilpo, Li Hongzhang had missed a key opportunity to destroy their transports. He had made a crucial strategic error, ordering his fleet to sortie east of the Yalu River, away from the Korean peninsula. Basically, he was trying to minimize any risk to his precious two battleships. He opted to use his fleet to deter attacks and to help the Qing convoys of troops. In his mindset, it was a prevent-defeat strategy. He sought to preserve his navy, and this decision ceded the initiative to the Japanese. Now, the Japanese could choose the timing and the location of hostilities. Obviously, Li Hongzhang believed time was on his side and that eventually they would just overwhelm the Japanese with pure numbers. He was prolonging as much as he could, because there was also the belief that the winter months in Korea and Manchuria would hurt the Japanese, while the Manchu warriors would hold a distinct advantage. And while that might sound silly, he wasn't wrong in that regard. The Japanese will have an enormous problem when it comes to the winter conditions, particularly in Manchuria. Now, as a result of Li Hongzhang trying to thwart further conflict, the Qing had deliberately encamped their forces outside Seoul. General Ye Jiqiao had 3,000 men stationed at Sangwon, and another 1,000 at his HQ in Qianan, just a bit northeast of Asan. He had been hunkering down, awaiting the arrival of reinforcements. But the Battle of Pyeongdu and the loss of the Kaohsiung delivered an enormous setback to that. Major General Oshima had roughly 4,000 men with him, and he began to march upon Asan from Seoul. Ye Jiqiao was very aware of this, and he had his men erect forts, dig trenches, made earthworks, and flooded surrounding rice paddies in preparation. Ye Jiqiao planned a pincer attack against Seoul by massing troops at Pyongyang in the north and Asan in the south. The Japanese divided their forces to make a night attack. There was going to be a small diversionary force who would engage the Qing at the front, while the main bulk of the army would march upon their rear flank. The diversionary force consisted of 4 companies of infantry, with 1 engineer who began their attack on the night of July the 28th. Meanwhile, 9 other companies of infantry, 1 cavalry and 1 battalion of artillery snuck around the Qing defensive lines by crossing the Ansong River. The Qing fought hard, but they were unable to hold out. The Qing forces at Songwon had to flee for their lives back to Asan, which was just 10 miles southwest. And in doing so, they had left a large amount of weapons and supplies. The Japanese pursued them to Asan, where further disaster struck the Chinese. Despite spending over 3 weeks fortifying the area, it seems that their defeat at Sangwon had broken their morale, as the Qing forces at Asan literally fled upon seeing the Japanese approaching the city. As a result, the Japanese took Asan the very next day. The Chinese were estimated to have 500 casualties, while serving the Japanese just 34 deaths and 54 wounded. The Qing survivors fled towards Pyongyang, which would be a brutal 26-day march, as they had to detour widely to avoid being hit by other Japanese forces coming out of Seoul. The victory confounded colonists, who had all come to a similar conclusion that, quote, "The Chinese forces fight badly and are ill-equipped." A reporter for the Yokohama-based Japan Weekly Mail had this to say about the issue. "The Chinese are indeed skilled in the art of running away. As they fled, they generally cast off their uniforms and donned the clothes of Koreans, made the best of their way to what they considered safe places. The directions toward which they fled are unmistakably indicated by the cast-off uniforms. Even the vice commander of the Chinese troops appeared to have been tempted to avail himself by this method, for his uniform was left behind in camp." It would be a theme played out during this war. The Qing forces would take the habit of disguising themselves as civilians to escape battles. And this would unfortunately result in many Japanese troops not trusting Chinese civilians near battlefields, leading to atrocities. It is also plain to see why Qing troops would do this. As we have already said, retreating was met with extremely harsh punishment. You were literally better off trying to escape into the crowd. A commentator from the Shanghai-based North China Herald had a very different take on the Battle of Sangwan. He had this to say. "The Chinese had retired from Asan district after several days of heavy fighting. 10,000 Japanese against just 3,500 Chinese. In the first day, the Japanese were met with sharp reserve and severe losses, the Chinese loss being unimportant. On July the 29th, the Chinese withdrew, leaving the camp in charge of a guard of 300 men, who were attacked and captured by an overwhelming force of Japanese before dawn. The guard were killed. The Japanese lost 500 men, found only heavy baggage in the camp, and they took no prisoners. Many Chinese non-combatants in the vicinity were also slain." Despite such claims, the Japanese had not engaged a small guard at Asan. It was the main body of the Qing forces. The Qing had been handily defeated, and alongside the men lost, a ton of equipment was lost as well. The Qing court had no way of knowing any of this, of course, because of the cell-like structure of their military, who would simply report back to them victories or very minor defeats. In fact, on August the 3rd, General Li Hongzhang was congratulated in an imperial decree for, quote, "killing over 2,000 warren." He received bonus payment for himself and his troops. Later on, when the Qing court figured out what had really happened, General Li Hongzhang would escape decapitation only because he used the bonus payments from said rewards to pay off officials to speak on his behalf. From the offset of the war, the Qing government had a policy of publicizing false war bulletins. But the realities of what was actually happening on the battlefields could not be concealed from Western viewers. Every battle was reported as a Chinese triumph in China, and this was very reminiscent of our tale of the French Sino-War. A small article sprang up from a British reporter in Shanghai, stating this. "I read somewhere during the Franco-Chinese War, the native papers of Shanghai reported the death of Admiral Courbet 37 times, while the number of the killed amongst the French, according to these reliable sheets, reached 1.6 million. The amount of falsehood which these papers have poured forth since the commencement of the War of Pygmies and Pigtails is simply astounding. Oh, that the word liar had the same force in Chinese as in English, for no other purpose than to enable one to tell a celestial, 'You are a liar.'" Now, there are a wide variety of reasons the Qing government pumped up the propaganda this way. Ironically, a major reason was because of their policy of decapitating defeated commanders. The Qing court officials also had barely any real knowledge of what was going on because, number one, all the commanders were sending false reports back to them. Number two, when defeated commanders were brought back to Beijing, they were beheaded so fast, they never got any time to actually make a real report on what occurred at the battlefield. Thus, the Qing court would only really figure out things by the time the war was getting much closer to Beijing. Oh, and above all else, the Qing court could not allow the bad reports to get to the Han public, out of fear they would rise up to topple their Manchu rule, something that remained their top obsession throughout the dynasty's lifetime. After the defeat at Asan, a rumor emerged that the emperor had demoted Li Hongzhang by stripping him of the Order of the Yellow Riding Jacket. Many speculated Li Hongzhang was demoted because he failed to thwart war. Regardless, Li Hongzhang's presumed demotion cast a shadow over his ability to perform official dealings. Li Hongzhang would tragically become a very useful Han scapegoat for the Qing dynasty. Now, while the loss at Asan meant the Qing plan to perform a pincer attack against Seoul was lost, it certainly did not mean the loss of Korea, however. The bulk of the Qing forces were stationed at Pyongyang now, the old capital of Korea. The city sat on the right bank of the Daetong River, which was large enough to provide a shipping route to the sea. Holding Pyongyang was imperative. It defended the approach to the Yalu River, and behind it lay Manchuria, Qing soil. Pyongyang was surrounded by a wide river to the east and south, with cliffs along the river banks, mountains to the north, and a massive city with fortified walls that could prolong a siege. The Qing seemed to hold all the major advantages. They had been amassing troops and supplies and constructing fortifications at Pyongyang for almost 12 months by this point. Altogether, the Qing had 13,000 troops dispersed at 27 forts surrounded by trenches and moats. The majority of the Qing troops also arrived to Pyongyang by boat, while the Japanese would have to trek overland via miserable Korean roadways crossing mountains and rivers. The Qing had invested a lot into Pyongyang because they were not just defending the city, they intended to recapture the rest of Korea using it as a main base. Thus, it was given their most modern equipment. Some Qing troops would carry American Winchester rifles. They had a total of 4 artillery pieces, 6 machine guns, and 28 mountain guns. On paper, this looked wonderful for them. However, there were serious problems. The reality of the situation was summed up prior to the battle by the Pall Mall Gazette. From more than one source, they agree that the Chinese army in North Korea is in a deplorable condition. The generals are said to be grossly incompetent, the minor officers discontented and disheartened, and the rank and file exhausted and dispirited. What roads there were a month ago have been washed away by floods. Transport through Manchuria to Korea is impossible. Guns, ammunition, and food stores are blocked, and spoiling all along the long route southward. Food is becoming scarcer every day at the front. The 4 Chinese commanders at Pyongyang each commanded their own army, but none adequately coordinated with another. When the Japanese attacked, they did parcel out static defensive sectors, but this became more of a hindrance than help. Their plan was very simple. If their lines failed to hold out at Pyongyang, surely they would be able to hold out at Yalu. Yes, that was a great plan. The Qing commanders in the field had no real-world, worst-case scenario plans. Weak logistics and organization plagued the Qing forces throughout the war. Now, as for the Japanese, Pyongyang held symbolic importance going all the way back to Toyotomi Hideyoshi's invasion during the 16th century. After the victory at Sangwon, the Japanese held a reinforced brigade about 8,000 strong within Korea, led by General Oshima. Around 7,000 of these troops were concentrated around Seoul and Chimolpo. The Japanese controlled southern Korea, and it was time to expel the Chinese from Korea completely. The Japanese had 4 routes to march upon Pyongyang from, one via Chimolpo, one from Busan, one from Wonsan, and another done amphibiously, by perhaps landing on the eastern coast near the mouth of the Daetong River. The Japanese were hard-pressed for time, as every day could see more Qing forces marching into Korea from Manchuria. Thus, the route from Busan was rejected, and they opted for sending the bulk of their forces to march from Chimolpo on the west coast, and 2 smaller forces from Wonsan on the east. The idea to land forces at the mouth of the Daetong River was not rejected outright, but they were going to only consider it as a last resort. The Chimilpo force would be the first army led by Marshal Yamagata Aritomo, consisting of the 5th Provisional Hiroshima Division, led by Lieutenant General Nozu Michitsura, and the 3rd Provincial Nagaono Division, led by General Katsura Taro. Although Aritomo held overall command, he did not land at Chimilpo until September the 12th. Thus, Lieutenant General Nozu would be commanding the 1st Army against Pyongyang. The Wansam column was led by Colonel Seito Tadashi. Another column would be coming from Sangyang, which was led by Major General Tatsumi Naobumi, with the combined brigade led by Major General Oshima Yoshimasa. Nozu's plan was for the combined brigade to make a frontal assault from the south, while his main division attacked from the southwest, making flanking maneuvers to be carried out by the other 2 columns. On September the 15th, approximately 10,000 Japanese troops made a 3-pronged attack on Pyongyang. At 4:30 a.m. on the 15th, the attack began from the east with an artillery barrage on the forts along the west bank of the Daetong River to divert the Chinese attention from the main attack. The Japanese feigned an attack from the south while Nozu and Oshima performed flanking maneuvers to deliver a massive blow from the north. The Japanese army's main bulk, designated to hit from the southwest, would actually not end up participating in the main attack that broke through the principal Chinese fortifications. The fighting was fierce, with the Chinese launching repeated cavalry charges, igniting prearranged blazes. Picture the scene from The Last Samurai film if you've seen that one. Amazing film, by the way. And if you haven't already checked it out, I actually did a historic film review of it over on the Pacific War channel. Yes, as everyone knows, it is not historically accurate by any means, but I would argue it does capture the feeling of the times. The Japanese found themselves in blazes of fire and repeatedly being charged upon by cavalry units, and it was certainly valiant, and it did showcase the bravery of the Qing forces, but it was also unbelievably stupid. The Qing had not taken advantage of the natural barrier that was the Daetong River, and they literally charged out into the field instead of forcing the Japanese to march through the muddy nightmare that it was. There was absolutely no attempt to attack the Japanese columns as they crossed the river when they were the most vulnerable. The Japanese had utterly failed to prepare the necessary equipment for crossing the Daetong River. They had no pontoon bridges, so they ended up just stealing Korean riverboats to ferry the troops across in secret. This was an enormous opportunity to smash the Japanese, but the Qing had utterly failed to grab it. The Japanese successfully deceived the Chinese as to where their main attack was coming from, and the 24-hour-long battle saw heavy rain, causing massive amounts of mud for the Japanese to march through. Again, very vulnerable. The Japanese artillery was too far back initially to be effective, leading the vanguard troops who had taken the first line of Qing defenses, some earthworks, to abandon them in the morning. This ironically caused the Qing to begin writing reports to the Chinese press back home that they had already won the battle, and that the Japanese were fleeing. In reality, the columns coming from Wonsan and Sangyong had seized the major fortress at Mongtan-te, due north of Pyongyang, giving the Japanese a position to bring their artillery to bear down upon the city walls. Once their artillery began raining hell from Mongtan-te, the Qing defensive position was shattered, and they offered their surrender at 4:30 on the 15th. During the night, many Qing forces tried to flee for the coast and the border town of Huiju, along with the lower reaches of the Yalu River. Japanese snipers killed large numbers of the fleeing Chinese as they tried to do so. As a result of the surrender, in the morning 2 Japanese columns entered the northern gate of the city unopposed. But because there was no way to communicate this with the rest of the forces, the main bulk of the Japanese army just continued to attack the city's west gate. Later that day, they would find it all undefended to their surprise. And later that morning, the combined brigade entered the city through the south gate. After seizing control of the city, it was estimated the Qing casualties were around 2,000 killed with another 4,000 wounded, while the Japanese had only reported 102 deaths and 433 wounded. I will point out, like most of this series, the sources tend to be Japanese, so you always have to take the numbers with a grain of salt. 700 Chinese were taken prisoner. Many escaped, however, fleeing for the Yalu River. Many believed, quote, "The flower of the Chinese army was all but annihilated at Pyongyang." The reason for this quote is indeed Li Hongzhang's elite Hui army was the best equipped and they were all there and they had lost there. Though there was also rumors in China that Li Hongzhang actually held back some of his best troops. A reporter at the Japan Weekly Mail had this to say of the event. What resistance was made could not have been very great. This is the more surprising, as the Chinese took possession of the city on the 4th of August and had ample time to thoroughly entrench themselves. Commander of the British Royal Artillery at Colchester, Colonel J.F. Maurice, had this to say about the battle. Field Marshal Yamagata had conducted the campaign in the most brilliant manner, and his tactics would not have disgraced a Western general. One article from the North China Herald noted the ethnic loyalties that did not look too good for the Manchu. Troops under the Muslim general Zhou Baogui had fought very well until he had perished in combat. In contrast, the Manchu troops have hitherto proved themselves utterly untrustworthy. The Jilin Manchus are far more intent on hunting for something to fill their opium pipes than on doing anything to uphold the dynasty which has pampered them for so long a time that they seem to have concluded that the dynasty exists for their special benefit. The forces of the Jilin division remained under the separate command of a Manchu general. The Manchu forces at Pyongyang retreated almost intact rather than fight. Indeed, the Muslim general Zhou Baogui, a Shandong citizen, died in action from the Japanese artillery, and a memorial was constructed for him. It did not look good for the Manchu, and the countless Han readers would have been ignited with bitterness over this. At Pyongyang, it was reported that Qing left behind 35 good field guns, hundreds of magazine rifles, hundreds of breech loaders, 2,000 tents, and 1,700 horses. Those magazine rifles, by the way, were noted to be superior to the Japanese Marauder rifles. Thus, they were a real steal. Hallmarks of the Qing campaign for the war were present at Pyongyang. The abandonment of large quantities of war supplies, the looting and abuse of local civilian populations, the torture and mutilations of POWs, and the use of civilian attire to flee the scene. The New York Times described the fleeing Chinese as, quote, only too apparent. Rifles, swords, and ammunition, which they had thrown away in their haste to escape, were constantly being found. The fugitives have acted the part of bandits. Villages had been pillaged and afterwards set on fire. Farms had been destroyed and all the stored produce burned. The Korean natives who had resisted the robbers had been ruthlessly slaughtered. Many bodies were found hacked with spear thrusts. The whole line of retreat was one scene of desolation. According to a reporter at Moskovsky Vedomosti, the people fear Chinese soldiers much more than the invasion by the Japanese. The Qing troops had little choice but to plunder or starve because their military's logistics were, frankly, a joke. Plunder was the only real solution for the Chinese soldier, while the Japanese soldier had a modern logistical line to keep them going. Western observers were notably disgusted with how the Qing treated POWs. After all, many nations had signed the August 22, 1864 Geneva Convention mandating the protection of POWs. But in a retrospect, the Qing did not even take care of their own forces, let alone the mouths of the enemy. There was also the issue of how the Qing had an official reward system built upon the payment per head. However, that does not explain the wide-ranging atrocities committed such as disembowelment, removal of facial features, extraction of livers, cutting off the penises and shoving in their mouths, and so on. The Qing Penal Code held insurrection to be, quote, the worst of the 10 abominations. And thus the Chinese most likely considered the Japanese actions to be basically an insurrection against their Confucian order, meriting the most severe of punishments. Punishments under the Penal Code, short of execution, included kangu, handcuffs, shackles, caning, ankle crushers, finger crushers, the Chinese rack, and the ever-favorite prolonged kneeling upon chains. A lot of the horror was due to the Chinese views of their own cultural supremacy and their disgust for barbarians. At one time, the American Secretary of State ordered his consul in Shanghai to hand over to the Qing authorities 2 Japanese who were found spying. The Qing officials promised no harm would come to them, but we are left with this as an account of that. The tortures included kneeling on chains while their captors stood on their legs, the removal of fingernails, the crushing of tongues, the pouring of boiling water on their handcuffed wrists until the metal reached the bone, the smashing of their groins, and the decapitation just before they expired from all the other abuses. The Japanese, coming off of the bad publicity of the Kaohsiung incident, took the opportunity to earn some recognition from the West by showcasing how their modern Japanese medical units treated the Chinese POWs with the utmost of care. The Japanese military transported around 600 POWs to Tokyo, 111 of whom were sick or wounded, who notably received top-quality care. A correspondent from the Japan Weekly Mail had this to say, and do note this is again a Japanese news source speaking about something in Japan. What has proved 1,000 times more interesting to me is the way the Chinese prisoners and wounded have been treated, and for this I hardly know how to express my admiration. I had some conversation with a captured commander. He said he could not understand the meaning of the Japanese kindness. I went from there to the hospital for wounded Chinese. They were treated exactly as if they were Japanese. I do not see how Japan can be refused the place she rightfully claims among the civilized nations of the world. Again, this is from a Japanese correspondent who is obviously trying to play it up because, again, Japan is looking to join the world powers. After the Battle of Pyongyang, there would be scant to no reports about the welfare of Qing POWs. Diaries from Japanese soldiers after the war would indicate the Japanese were not so interested in taking POWs since they would just burden their supply lines as they marched deeper into Manchuria. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, written and narrated by me. And hey, if after all that you were still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel over at YouTube, where I've just now unleashed my episode on Jiang Zongchang, the dog meat general, the monster behind the meme. And just a friendly reminder, I now myself have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. And over there, this month's exclusive podcast is part 3 of my series about General Ishiwara Kanji, the mastermind behind the Mukden incident and the author behind the Final War theory. Check it out, it would mean a lot to me. The battles of Sangwon and Pyongyang had caused the Qing forces to flee all the way to the last existing natural barrier before Manchuria, the Yalu River. Will the Qing be able to stop the Japanese from marching upon their home soil of Manchuria? Only time will tell.